Hi, Kate. Thank you for joining us to talk about perpetrator work and child protection today. WWP places importance on child protection because the work of perpetrator programs affects the lives of children. Therefore, their needs must come first. We're aiming to make children more visible and safer in all our interventions. So we're really happy to have you here today as an expert in the field to talk us through some of the issues facing child protection in perpetrator work. So if we can begin today with you briefly introducing yourself and your background.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Lorna. So I'm Kate Iwi, and I've been working in the perpetrator work field for about 30 years, and more recently, for the past 7 years, I've been running a project on domestic violence and abuse that sits within children's social care in an area of London in the UK. Where we run interventions with perpetrators, survivors, and children who are impacted by domestic abuse.
Great, thank you so much. And do you think enough focus is put on child protection during domestic violence interventions?
So in general perpetrator work, I think there's not nearly enough focus on children, both impacts on children and planning for the safety of children. I also don't think that there's enough expectation on perpetrators, usually men, as fathers and parents, in terms of protecting and just contributing to the parenting labour in families. On the other hand, and a word of caution that within children's social care, there's a strong focus on children as harmed by parental domestic abuse. And what can come out of that is a disproportionate focus and expectation on victims to do more work around protecting their children, around they're often expected to go on parenting courses and to run most of the linking with social services departments. And so it's important, whilst trying to promote child protection in this work, that we also are really mindful of avoiding that having a sort of a negative impact, in fact, on survivors who might then be seen as failing to protect.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point to raise, actually. And it brings us quite nicely onto the next question, and maybe I will even rephrase this question a little bit. What more can be done to shift the focus to the impact that domestic violence has on children, specifically in the context of the perpetrator?
Well, it's children and being a parent is a huge, or can be a huge, motivator for change. And in many ways, perpetrator work, if it doesn't focus enough on that, is missing a trick. Because a lot of the perpetrators that we work with really do want to see themselves as good parents and role models for their children. But there's also so much overlap between how people are as parents and how they are as partners. So a lot of perpetrators of domestic abuse are essentially using abuse to protect their entitlement to be kind of selfish, to put their wants and needs first. And so it goes with that they're often also parents who use very parent-centered methods with their children rather than child-centered. So they're likely to also be smacking their children or sending their children away, you know, things that are easy wins in the short term for them, and really don't lead to the kind of long-term changes for their children or relationships with their children. So actually there's a lot of overlap in learning about child-centered parenting and just about other-centered relationships. So that feels like it can change a lot. And the way that it can be done is including a lot more, just a lot more emphasis on children all the way through programs. So where I work in every, we have a structured group program, and in every session, we're speaking about the children too. Just from the very start, we begin with an introduction from everyone in groups who remind everyone else of their names and their partners' names and their children's names, so that in many ways, imaginatively, we people the room with those who are impacted by their violence and abuse from the start, and the children are there from the very outset.
Yeah, that's I think that's a really important way to ensure that children remain in focus. And it also leads us quite well to the next question, but perhaps that was already an answer to that question, which was, can you give an example of good practice in perpetrator work when addressing the issue of child protection? So you mentioned making sure that their names are mentioned, that they are kind of present within the work. But is there anything else? Is there anything else that you've seen in perpetrator work that you think is good practice?
We use in the project where I work, we use a lot of drama exercises and role play exercises, and examples of those around children is that there's an exercise where we sit all the men on the floor with their eyes closed, and we talk them into a role of a child who's had a difficult day and gone to bed and gone to sleep, and then they wake up and hear these sounds. And at that point, depending on whether we're online or in person, I'll give you the in-person version, the workers go outside the room and enact an argument through a closed door, such that the men will be able to half hear it, and it's an argument about the child, and it ends with crashing and screaming, and then a period of silence. And when we go back in, we talk to them about what they felt, how long they'd have stayed awake, what they expect they'd have done if their dad had walked into the room at that moment, and what would have been said about that at breakfast the next morning. And it gives them a really strong, empathetic understanding of what their children might be going through. And it also really puts the lie to the idea that the children were asleep in bed just because the children haven't raised it with them. But we also do other exercises where we get the men, not with their eyes closed, but into roles of children and enact issues of child contact and difficult areas where, you know, a parent is perhaps trying to speak badly about the other parent to the children. And so we have ways of working through all of those that really directly create empathy. But we also use instances of where the people that we're working with have had their own trauma history. We use instances of working through their trauma history, and we link some of that back gently to what that might be like for their children. And the idea that by working on themselves, they're doing something for their children that nobody ever got their abuser to do for them. And so all the while sort of linking their own experiences with their children's experiences. And finally, we also use quite a lot of just didactic teaching. about impacts. I think a lot of people still of the kind of belief that what children don't remember won't affect them. And so, you know, what they do around babies and children who are pre-verbal, they kind of write off because it won't be remembered. And there's actually a bit of real didactic learning there about this is the period where children are most affected by trauma, because essentially it's where the hardwiring of the brain is forming, the attachment styles and patterns. And even though they won't remember incidents, it will be remembered in their responses, their bodies, their fight-flight systems, and so on. And actually having people really understand that is useful. So the learning goes on a range of levels. The other thing that we need to do a lot, I think, is be mindful of the impact that domestic abuse has on the survivor's parenting and their capacity and ability to manage the children, and the ways that abusers often undermine their partner's parenting. And yeah, so that also needs thinking in all the way through and asking about and addressing very directly.
Yeah, I think that's really gives us a great detailed idea of the work that you're doing, and the different layers and the complexities of working in this field and ensuring children remain focused at the same time as trying to instill this feeling of empathy. And yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from all of that. So thank you so much for sharing. Potentially, you also answered the next question in that answer, but maybe if you would like to just think of one thing that you would like to see more of in perpetrator programs to address child protection and well-being, because we're a European network. So maybe if you could think of one thing that could help perpetrator programs across Europe, and one simple thing to implement into programs.
I just wanted to say, I'm just going to add something that I forgot to say earlier, and I'll come to that as well. But I would really like to see perpetrator work brought closer with child protection work in such a way as it's seen as, in many ways, an answer to victim blame within children's services, because I actually think that a better focus on the person who's bringing the risk can alleviate the focus on survivors to protect children when they can't protect themselves, clearly. And you know, that actually it seems to me that that's a particularly constructive way into the difficulties that child protection systems have with supporting rather than blaming survivors. And one thing that I would like to see change, I think really at every point when a program is working on an area of abuse, if the person they're working with is a father, I think it's really useful to think about, and how would that be in relation to the children? So if there's something about emotional abuse of partners, are they thinking in and covering emotional abuse of children? You know, appreciation of partners, appreciations of children, listening to partners, listening to children. You know, it feels that there's very frequently a parallel track, you know, another thing to say that's just about always asking, and how might this be relevant to this person as a parent? And I think that's what we need to be doing. I also would say that if programs work directly with children, it helps them keep children in mind. That's not always possible, I fully recognise. But the same way as that programs, when we work with survivors and partners, it's impossible not to keep them in mind, really. When we're also working with and hearing from children, there they are. Where you're not working with children, that has to be a really systematic exercise of mindfulness.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that and all of your experience in this field. I think you've given us a really great overview of how perpetrator programs can ensure that children are really in the focus, and the different kinds of exercises that perpetrator programs can use to ensure that children are remaining in focus, that perpetrators are understanding how this might affect their children, and also that these that the child protection issues are not just placed on the survivors themselves. So thank you so much for sharing all of that, Kate.
You're welcome. And I'd say as well that the exercises, the learning about things like the impacts of trauma on brain development and on attachment styles and so on, social learning, gendered learning and all of those things. When people focus on it, thinking about their children, they're also learning about how they themselves have been traumatized, gendered, and so on. So it never feels like a waste of time. Feels like you can mostly be doing both things at once.
Well, Kate, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for sharing all of these really important insights with us.
Thank you very much, Lorna.
Okay,
Take care.
Have a nice day.
You too.